Hi, good evening, everyone. Really nice to see you here, and thanks for joining us tonight for the first Lemley family lecture of this academic year. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor here in political science and international and public affairs, and also currently serve as provost here at Brown. And with us tonight, we are honored to have Harvard University professor Rebecca Henderson, who will be speaking about reimagining capitalism. And this is really interesting because in this same room, a couple of years ago and then last year as well, Ben Armstrong and I taught a undergraduate version of Reimagining Capitalism, which was adapted from Rebecca's really successful course, MBA course that she taught, and that I had the great fortune of sitting in on some of the sessions. So it's really nice sort of closed circle here. And I've known Rebecca for many, many years. When we started teaching together in the late 1980s, we had offices next to each other at MIT. We then co-taught a class together a number of years later around sustainability, and you're in for an incredible treat. I mean, Rebecca is not only just an amazing scholar and incredibly gifted teacher, but really someone who has been able to translate the incredible work that she does into making real change in the world. And that's like the best that you can get if you're an academic. The fact that Professor Henderson is here tonight stems from the generosity of Wayne Lemley, who we're also very fortunate to have with us tonight. He's a 1980 Brown PhD graduate who wanted us to have a series here at Brown that brought leading scholars, practitioners like Professor Henderson to campus to enrich the kind of intellectual life and the conversation and the debates that we have on campus. Rebecca is the third speaker. The first two were Nobel Prize winner Jennifer Doudna, and then the writer Isabel Wilkerson, who had written this very well-known book called Caste. So it's wonderful to have Rebecca join in this group, and thank you, Wayne, for making this possible. Let me just say a few words about Rebecca, and then I'll get off the stage and let the real show start. Rebecca Henderson is the John and Natty McArthur University professor at Harvard University and the author of this remarkable book called Reimagining Capitalism, which, as I said, she developed a course on. She's also, which is important to know, an expert on innovation and organizational change. That's what she actually has spent many, many years doing research and teaching on. And her research in recent years, but I would say probably always, has always explored, what can the private sector do to actually bring about real change in our society? How do we reconcile market and market incentives with a real need and also a desire to bring about positive social change, whether in the environment or social settings, et cetera. And Rebecca has looked at that at this intersection of innovation, productivity, and also social justice as well. Now, she is one of 25 university professors at Harvard, so in the pecking order, that's like the top of where you go, and also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And she's a fellow both at the British Academy and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her publications are way too long for me to list, but a couple that I think are important for you to know about. One is the piece Leading Sustainable Change, an organizational perspective. In addition to being an economist of strategy and innovation, Rebecca has done a lot of work on understanding organizations, and especially the concept of relational contracting and what that does in terms of the operations within organizations and across organizations. And also, she wrote this really wonderful piece, Accelerating Energy Innovation, Lessons from Multiple Sectors. Now, for several years, she taught Reimagining Capitalism, which I was, as I said, lucky enough to sit in on, and then take a version of it and bring it here to Brown. And I see there's several of students from that first version of Reimagining Capitalism here. And what's great is that this was an idea that Rebecca had. How do we bring something like this into a place like Harvard Business School? And because of her many, many talents, it became an extremely popular course, had over 300 students in it, and really, really shaped, I think, the curriculum at Harvard, but beyond Harvard. And in the introduction of, if you have read the book, and I know some of the students who took the course here did read the book, in the introduction, Rebecca talks about how the book went to press just before the pandemic, sort of put us in lockdown. I think the book came out in April of 2020. And she was worried, like, what's going to happen to this book that's, coming out at a time of incredible crisis, and worried if it would somehow get lost. And what we know is exactly the opposite has happened, that the pandemic, unfortunately, has exacerbated many of the challenges and tensions that are described in the book, and have actually called on all of us in higher education to sort of step up and really try to address these major challenges. So Rebecca, it's so wonderful to be able to host you here at Brown, and everyone please join me in welcoming Rebecca Henderson.
Rick, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm honored you should have taken the time to come and hear me speak. And my thanks to those of you who have read the book and have still decided to come to this talk, because with luck, I'll be relatively consistent. May I thank Mr. Lemley, who's here, for setting up this series. I'm a little humbled by the people who've come to speak before me, Rick. I'm not sure you should have told me who the two previous speakers were, but it's very, very exciting to be here. And I'd like to give a special welcome to my husband, who is on the faculty at Brown, Professor Jim Marone. So Jim, thank you for being here too, because you know every line in this book. So, Reimagining Capitalism. My work is about an unlikely idea, namely that the private sector could play an important contributory role in rebalancing our society and tackling some of the horrendous problems we face, from climate change to environmental degradation, to accelerating inequality, to the slow destruction of our institutions. And so this is an unlikely thesis. It's a little unlikely even in a business school. It's pretty unlikely anywhere else. But before I launch into why I think this is potentially a good idea, let me ask you. The title of my book makes it clear that I'm an incrementalist and a reformist. I think we need to reform and reimagine capitalism. May I ask, is there anyone in the room who thinks perhaps we should just get rid of it? Anyone? Just a few? Just a few? Come on, I'm on the Brown campus. I can't believe. So I'm guessing if I asked a room full of undergraduates, give me a number, half would say, maybe, that we should get rid of it. I will tell you, right before the pandemic, we asked the first-year Harvard Business School class, is capitalism broken? And 50% of them said yes. So something is wrong. I've been talking to a lot of younger audiences, and they say, why reimagine this? Why not get rid of it? And so we might come back to that. But for the moment, I'm going to assume that capitalism is the best we have so far to kind of balance multiple needs, and what we need is radical reform. What kind of reform, and why do I think business might have a role to play here? So first, my vision of what has gone wrong is that our system is out of balance. If we think of as a healthy society as based on three strong pillars, the free market, because free markets are full of innovation and competition and growth, and we like the free market, but also on a democratically accountable, capable, legitimate government, and as a third pillar, strong civil society. And there I'm throwing in sort of everything else, but I'm including the rule of law, a free press, a respect for truth, labor representation. And my understanding is that this is not a revolutionary idea. The idea that strong, prosperous societies that benefit everyone look like this comes straight out of development economics and political science of the last 100 years, that the free market is incredibly important, but that without the institutions to balance it, things get out of whack. And what we have now is a free market radically out of whack. Let me give you, for me, what is the central example. There are, of course, many, but the central example is that it is quite legal to burn fossil fuels and emit greenhouse gases. That is weird. It's very strange. Imagine, if you like, for a moment, that I'm holding $10 worth of coal-fired electricity in my hands. That's about enough power to power my cell phone for roughly 10 years. Not so bad. But coal-fired electricity imposes enormous costs on our world. It imposes public health costs here and now, because when you burn coal, you generate nitrous oxide, sulfur, mercury, lead, that the people in public health tell us are responsible for millions of deaths every year. And they say, after much pressing, that $10 worth of coal-fired electricity on average is causing $8 worth of harm to human health. And my friends in environmental economics tell me it's causing at least $8 worth of climate damage. So that $10 worth of carbon, of coal-fired electricity, is imposing $16 worth of damage on the rest of society. Now, I could go through all kinds of other examples, like when our major corporations vote against increases in the budget for social welfare, for education and health. Why? Because they're maximizing their profits. They've been told that their first duty is to maximize shareholder returns. And if you can maximize shareholder returns without constraint, one of the most effective ways to do that is to burn coal and by the local regulators. And neither of those is good for the society. There's a major hearing opening on Capitol Hill today, perhaps you saw this, on the degree to which the fossil fuel companies have been spreading disinformation about climate change, denying the reality of climate change and actively lobbying against regulation. And there's a new report out showing that the fossil fuel companies have been flooding the Washington media with disinformation in advance of the hearings. So we have a market system that is productive and innovative and has driven unimaginable growth, but that is almost uncontrolled. Now again, I'm caricaturing, but that is out of balance with our society. So if that's the problem, well, surely the answer is to rebuild the balance. Why look to business for that? Surely our first pass answer must be to rebuild our political system so that we have a genuine democracy in which everyone's voice is heard, to rebuild our bureaucracy and the capability of our government so that we can enact the kind of sensible regulations that will deal with the environmental problems we face, that will strengthen our society so that we have the kind of education and healthcare systems that let everyone participate in the market. Surely that's what we need. Plus, of course, a massive cultural and social movement to support such a government that thinks not only about me right now, but about us and later. Perhaps we even need a philosophical revolution. Martha Nussbaum at Chicago has argued persuasively that we need a new religion, a sense of ourselves as a collective committed to the well-being of the whole, to balance our very strong focus on ourselves. So I think that's right. Sounds good. Sounds hard. Sounds really hard. In fact, if we look at where we're going politically and socially, it looks as though our institutions are going in the wrong direction. And here I summarize. But we're looking at more polarization, less collective action, more hate. So what is to be done? One direction, I believe, is to look to the private sector. Now, why do that? I mean, If business is partly responsible for the horrible mess we're in, why should we think that business can help get us out of it? Seems a little strange. Well, in the first place, business has a strong economic case for fixing the problems that we face. Imagine for a moment that business was a single entity. So suppose Rick here, I think he's up to the task, he runs every company on the planet. Now, that would create other kinds of problems, and we'd have to make sure the companies were genuinely competing with each other and so on, but he owns everything. Does he have an interest to fix climate change? Yes, he does. Is it in his interest to live in a world where floods and droughts destabilize the climate, where hundreds of millions of people migrate north as the harvests fail, where not all, but a very large fraction of the major coastal cities are underwater? That's the track we're on. 4.9 degrees Fahrenheit is where we're going if we don't curb our emissions. I don't think there'll be much of Providence above water. Certainly Boston will flood. That's not good for business, right? Destroying the ecosystems on which we rely, not good for business. Not investing in education and health so that a very large fraction of the population says, this isn't working for me, and they are immensely angry and want to pull the whole thing down, not good for business. When I'm talking to a room full of CEOs, I say, increased political volatility, not good for business. When I'm feeling passionate, I say, have you tried doing business in societies without the rule of law? It's not fun. You don't want to go there. So business has a collective case for action. So now you're thinking, well, excuse me, Professor Henderson, there's a free riding problem. There's a collective action problem. Firms are famous for competing with each other, and now I'm talking about a competitive movement. So that's what the book's about. 288 pages on how to solve the free riding problem. You ready? 10 minutes? Here we go. How do you solve the free riding problem? Well, first, we redefine the purpose of the firm. The purpose of the firm is not, and never should have been, to maximize value for shareholders. That was always a means to an end. The end was building a prosperous, free society. When maximizing shareholder value means trashing the planet and destroying our institutions, that's not building a prosperous and free society. We need to remember that the purpose of the firm is to solve public problems profitably. That's a formulation from my colleague Colin Mayer at Oxford, but I really like it. Solve public problems like create jobs, invest in green energy, remake the agricultural system, rebuild our cities, and do it profitably. Money should be a means to an end. Making profits at decent returns to an investment, a means to an end, not an end in itself. This is not a crazy off-the-wall idea. There are already thousands of companies who have embraced a purpose which is more than making money. My friend Erik Osmundson runs a garbage company in Norway. He was in private equity, so this isn't a very sexy career move. But he knew that if we could change the garbage industry, the waste industry, from throwing stuff into holes in the ground where it generates methane, contributes to the environmental problems, if instead we could make the waste stream a source of raw materials, if we could build a true circular economy, then it would take, I think the number is something like 5 or 6% of emissions out of the total. So he became the CEO of a garbage company because he wanted to save the world. The purpose of the company is to reform the waste system. Making money is necessary, but it's not the goal. Now, perhaps you think this is nice. Purpose-driven firms sound kind of cool. She's got a few examples. Are they really legal? Are they moral? Are they feasible? Do I put up a flag saying I'm a purpose-driven company and tomorrow I go out of business? So yes, they're completely legal. We could talk more about that later if you'd like. Doesn't run afoul of fiduciary responsibilities. Yes, they're completely moral. I write extensively about that. I think if you are a genuine capitalist and you care about capitalism, this is the only way to go. In fact, you have a moral duty to begin to rebuild our institutions and tackle these major public problems. The feasibility question, though, that's a little trickier, right? If I have a purpose, won't I be outcompeted by those who can make money at any cost? If I'm a nice guy, won't I be outcompeted by the nasty guys? I'm using guys in a gender-neutral term, forgive me. Won't I be outcompeted by the bottom feeders? So, here's the thing. It is eminently possible to make money and address major public goods problems. In fact, right now, it may be the best way to make money because our society is changing. Employees are increasingly demanding that their firms have a greater purpose. There's a CEO friend of mine who called me a while back. He said, Rebecca, you know I think all this sustainability stuff is bullshit. And I said, yes, Fred, not his real name. I know you think that. He said, but everyone I'm trying to hire thinks it's a big deal. Could you come and talk about it? 87% of the 93% of CEOs who say climate change is a big challenge and I'm fully committed to solving it, 83% of them say, and it will have major impacts on my ability to attract, train, and retain talent. So this is a moment when employees are insisting. It's also a moment when consumers are beginning to insist that if they have a choice, they won't pay more yet for sustainably produced products, but they will shift brands. We're seeing some of the sustainable brands grow very significantly faster than the more conventional brands. We're seeing firms understanding that managing this way means reducing risks. In the pandemic, we have a lot of evidence that it was the purpose-driven firms who had invested in their employees, who had managed their supply chain on the basis of trust and connection, that were in a much better position to be resilient to the shock of the pandemic. We've seen that embracing purpose can lower your costs. Walmart, that was early in this area, see above about improving their public relations, decided to dramatically reduce their energy use. They took $1 billion a year straight to the bottom line just by redesigning their trucking fleet and making it more efficient. $1 billion a year. The available studies suggest that most firms can cut their energy use by 50% on an NPV positive, that is a positive rate of return on capital basis. At Harvard, we've cut our energy use by more than that on a positive NPV basis. So there is a business case for doing the right thing. And I haven't even had to talk about Elon Musk, who just became the richest man on the planet by saying, no, we have to transition the automotive industry. Or the CEO of Impossible Foods, who said, we have to get off eating meat. I'm going to build a new company that really addresses these new issues. The adoption of purpose gives a sense of vision that is fundamental to innovation. So these purpose-driven firms are showing up everywhere. There's another thing that's interesting about purpose-driven firms. And to tell you about it, I have to give you an odd fact. You ready for the odd fact? In the average industry, the 10% most productive firms are more than twice as productive as the least 10% of the least productive firms in the industry. Let me say that in English. In the average industry, the most productive firms are making twice as much with the same measured inputs, capital, inputs, labor, as the least productive firms. I spent 20 years in windowless conference rooms trying to make this result go away. Economists hated it. It had to be, we weren't measuring capital right, we weren't measuring inputs right, we weren't measuring price-cost margins in the product markets right. No, it's good, it's true, it's real. And we know it's true across the world. Indeed, in regions like China and India, the disparity is even larger. What is happening? What is happening is the high productivity firms are running high performance work systems. What's a high performance work system? This is going to sound truly revolutionary. You treat your people with dignity and respect. You pay them decently. You give them power to improve their jobs so they can innovate on the ground. You drive communication right throughout the firm. You encourage innovation. You encourage communication. This is not a new idea. We've known about these high-performance work systems for at least, 30, 40 years? Think Toyota? It's not a big idea. But it's everywhere. And it's real. And it's twice the productivity. So, why doesn't everyone adopt a high-performance work system? Because you're employees. If you stand up and say, as General Motors did, we've discovered that if we trusted you all and treated you with dignity and respect, things would go a lot better. Trust us. It's a horrible grinding noise. Nothing happens. It takes purpose and authenticity and time and commitment to build these kinds of firms. But can they survive in a competitive market? Absolutely they can. And we have increasingly good quantitative data suggest that's the case. Now, maybe you're with me so far so good. Okay, capitalism is broken. Let's try the private sector for a part of the solution. It's got to be purpose-driven firms. They can survive. Great. They're still just individual firms. What good is that? Maybe it's 20, 30% of firms. What good is that? Well, let me suggest that these firms could be catalytic to driving larger systemic change. Why? Because when you have a purpose-driven firm in an industry showing that you can make money in these different kinds of ways, and when everyone can see the world is changing and all their employees want you to do something, then not doing anything gets harder and harder. So in industry after industry, these firms are catalysts for change. When the CEO of Unilever announced he was going to halve the environmental footprint of his firm, a 60 billion euro European consumer goods companies, and that he was going to stop quarterly guidance because he needed to focus on the long term to really build a purpose-driven firm, the stock dropped 8%. That was his first day as CEO. He said afterwards he made the announcement on the first day because he figured the board couldn't fire him. He took his company from one of the weakest performers in the industry to one of the strongest. And as he did it, he forced every other firm to start moving. So these firms have very strong effects within their industries. Of course that's not enough. Of course! Even if everyone was purpose-driven, it wouldn't be enough. Erik Osmundsen in Norway was able to move most of his competitors to saying, okay, we won't dump the trash in holes in the ground, and we won't bribe the regulators, and we won't mislabel the medical waste and ship it to Africa. We'll do the right thing. But if there's no one to enforce doing the right thing, it doesn't happen. Initially, companies thought they could fix this on their own. In food, for example, where the big consumer goods companies saw they had to stop deforestation, 67% of the world's traded volume in industries like palm oil and soy and beef got together and said, we won't buy dirty products. We're going to go clean. 67% sounds like a big number. They thought they could tip the whole industry that deforestation would stop. But it didn't. Because the Chinese and the Indians were like, oh, well, you cut down primary rainforest to grow that palm oil. It's cheap. We'll buy it. So even though they started to cooperate with each other, which was fabulous and made a lot of difference because they developed good metrics and ways to measure when people were doing the wrong thing, it wasn't enough. So what good are purpose-driven firms? Well, these firms have a strong economic incentive to make everyone else behave better. If you have built your brand on buying deforestation-free palm oil, you want everyone else to have to buy it too, so that they have the same cost structure as you do. If you built your brand on treating your people well and paying them decently, you don't want to be competing with firms that are pushing down wages and taking shortcuts and not offering decent benefits. So we now have an increasing cohort of firms that has a strong economic incentive to see the other firms move in this direction as well. Who do they look to? Who do they look to force everyone to behave well? Two constituencies. The first, don't laugh, is the capital markets, the people with all the money. Now, This is going to sound even more unlikely, right? The hedge fund managers ride to the rescue and save the world. So why might finance have an incredibly important role to play? Why might the rewiring of the capital markets help us out of the terrible mess we're in? First idea. Money is incredibly concentrated, and most of us care about the future. And so if you run a pension fund, your economic interest is not in whether one stock in your portfolio does a little bit better than another this month. What you care about is the whole value of the portfolio over the next 20 to 30 years. You are, to use a technical term, a universal owner. You own the universe of stocks. And you realize that the largest risk to this portfolio is political volatility, climate change, environmental destruction, and inequality. And so you have an economic interest in pushing the firms in your portfolio to behave better. Besides which, if you're a family foundation, the youngest generation is inheriting and they don't want this to go on. So we've got a lot of pressure on the big money to switch to be more sustainable. And retail investors, people like you and I, we want to put our money in good places. So the big investors are starting to feel like, whoops, we have to address climate change. Maybe we have to address biodiversity. Maybe we have to address political volatility. Maybe diversity and inequality. And as the money moves this way, we're developing new metrics, because for years we used only financial metrics to measure our firms. We're seeing a revolution in accounting. It's called ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance Metrics. Tell me before I invest in you, how much carbon are you emitting? How much are you paying your people? What's your turnover rate? What's your benefits? How are you doing on diversity? I want to know what I'm investing in. Both because I think some people just want to invest in purpose-driven firms, but a lot of people can see that this is the future and that purpose-driven firms are going to outperform. And by the way, I have to hold the whole portfolio. I want everyone moving in this direction. So we have an accounting revolution underway, which will let us hold firms accountable. Because, of course, without measures, firms can say we're going to go to net zero in 2050, and it's just words. We have to be able to measure. It has to be auditable, material, replicable. Really good measures. So finance is moving. Super exciting. It's why people like Larry Fink, who runs the largest asset management firm in the world with more than $9 trillion under management, are saying no, firms need to have a purpose. It's why we're seeing the emergence of the Net Zero Banking Confederation, where the big banks are saying the big risks here are environmental and social. We must work together to address them. And last but not least, I only have 1 minute, which is good, because I only have about a minute's worth of thing to say here, because this is really outrageous. I have come to believe that having at least a part of the private sector on this wavelength, committed to sustainability, committed to purpose, committed to their workforce, might have very significant political effects. One recent survey suggests that the single institution most people trust the most is the firm they work for. I'm not sure I believe it, but it's really interesting. Increasingly, the firm is the only place where people from both sides of the political divide come together. It's a place they trust. And when firms say climate change is real, democracy is important, that may have a real effect. Historically, there have been moments when our institutions have been under so much stress that the private sector has collectively sat down with representatives of civil society and with governments and said, okay, how do we design a society that works for all of us? Even if we had the world's perfect government, we would need business in active partnership with society and with government. Solving the problems we face means addressing hundreds of years of systemic racism, means transforming transportation, agriculture, construction, food, healthcare, IT. We can't do it without the private sector. not the private sector alone. In the end, we need a massive political and cultural movement to rebuild our institutions, rebalance our societies, and solve the enormous problems we face. But I believe that a motivated, purpose-driven private sector could be an important partner in such an effort. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Rebecca, and thank you for that. And we're going to open it up for question and answers, but I think I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question, and then we'll open it up, which is the cornerstone of the whole theory, which I completely buy, is purpose-driven firms and how important those are. Most firms are not purpose-driven. You've mentioned examples, and it seemed like it was always a great leader who was making, sort of the person who was in hedge fund, the Norwegian person who started the garbage recycling firm. But maybe you could tell us a little bit, because I know you've done a lot of work inside the firm. How can we get more firms to actually embrace purpose, since that seems to be such a cornerstone to the whole theory?
So the early examples of purpose-driven firms were mostly driven by leaders who were convinced this was the direction they wanted to move. But often those leaders could only move because the work had already been laid in the firm to make a difference. So in the case of Unilever that I mentioned, where Paul Polman announced he was going to halve the firm's environmental footprint, one of the reasons he felt comfortable saying that in public is that all across the firm, it's a big global international firm, there were individuals who had shown that this was possible. In the book, I talk about a man called Michel Ligens, who became brand manager for Lipton's tea, one of the least sexy products you could imagine. It's tea bag tea, not sexy. Commodity product, going nowhere. He came in and he said, I think we could turn this business around if we committed to sustainable tea. And everyone said, well, we know we can't charge any more for it. No one will pay any more for tea bag tea. And he said, well, but it's vital to secure the security of supply, and we're 30% of the world's tea. And so, and it'll give us better relationships with our investors, and our employees will like it, and let's try it. It took him 6 months to get that through the Unilever structure. Everyone said, this is a loopy idea. But he knew it was possible because someone who worked for him had shown that in Kenya, you could move to sustainably grown tea and really pay people more, get higher yields, and very much reduce your impact on the environment. And so, he moved. Tea brand did very well. It turned out people were willing to shift brands. They wouldn't pay more, but they would buy his tea. And when Paul came into Unilever, he could draw on examples like that to make the larger case. In so many firms that I work with now, CEOs are saying, this sustainability stuff, I don't know what it is, but nearly everyone who works for me, they know. They want me there. And so, 20 minutes is short, but we have enormous power for change. Not just the younger generation, although they make a huge difference. I was working with a room full of CEOs, trying to tell them that climate change was the future and they could make billions of dollars and they should move, and I was getting nowhere, like nowhere. And in desperation, I said, tell me, what do your children think about this? And the whole room shifted. So as employees, as children, as customers, as citizens, we have enormous power to push these firms. Yes, a few heroic leaders are out there first. Everyone else is moving because they're being pushed. It's really important to push. But there's a lot of room to change.
Great. Thank you. And I think being pushed is often the way to go. So why don't we open it up for questions? And we have people with microphones, so that if you have a question, please raise your hand, and people will come and give you a microphone. And if you could please just identify yourself.
Tony Levitas. I'm the director of the undergraduate public policy program at Watson. You know, the idea of a purpose-driven firm isn't entirely new. We've had debates over the nature of capitalist organizations for a long time. In some ways, some of this discussion sounds a little bit like the discussion over welfare capitalism in the 30s and 40s, where you get these kinds of firms coming along and doing things. And I'd like to believe that they have the oomph and the push to get there. But it didn't quite work out the last time capital was in such crisis, and people figured out purposes for firms, not all of which were so great. And I'm really struck by how silent and self-destructive capital has been with respect to things at a lower order of threat than climate change in some sense, and maybe that's the answer, but still, why you get Brexit or why you get the breakup or a successful attempt to create a unified market, and where is capital in these internal struggles over protectionism? Well, why aren't they showing up there when you think that's closer to their collective interest than maybe even climate change?
One of my friends read the book and said, Rebecca, why did you call this Reimagining Capitalism? You should have called it, could you please take us back to the capitalism of the 50s and 60s, only without the misogyny and the racism, please? So no, this is absolutely not a new idea. And no, I do not think purpose-driven firms can save us. I hope they might be catalytic in changing the rules such that everyone has to move. Because you're right, most firms, most of the time, look at them out there lobbying against climate change right now, in the Biden administration right now. So why might this time be different? I have two goals here. One is, I think it is really a problem that in the rhetoric of the last 50 years, we have not held firms to account for the effects they've had on institutions. We've been training our MBA students as if maximizing shareholder value really was the only goal, and that's a huge mistake. So even if you told me it never made any difference at all, I'd still want to change how we talked about what the purpose of a firm is and what it should be doing, even if many firms didn't live up to it. Because I want to remove the intellectual cover from those who can say it's fine to deny the reality of climate change or discriminate or push wages to the bottom or not care about what's happening in my supply chain because it maximizes shareholder value. That should not be okay to say in public. No one would say now in public that employing children was a good thing to do because, you know, they're very cheap and their little fingers have high manual dexterity. No one would say that in public. So part of this is an exercise in trying to shift the dominant conversation so that, and I think we did see this time, after George Floyd's murder, lots of firms made commitments on diversity. A lot of people said, well, you know, that's just blather, it's just what their employees insisted. Well, having been inside those firms, having made those commitments is creating all kinds of pressure inside the firm to actually do something. So having made the commitments is better than nothing. Are firms going to transform next year into angels of light? Absolutely not. I've spent more than 20 years on major corporate boards. It's not going to happen. But at the margin, if we can persuade firms to think about the bigger picture so that this is the conversation they're having, this is the pressure they're facing, I think that will be helpful, not enough. In the end, we must change the rules. There has to be a political solution. But having some segment of the dominant private class, elite saying, you know, we do need a political solution. If I to speak frankly, trying to separate some of business from a kind of old-fashioned drown government in the bathtub would be a huge advance. So yes, it is the same old thing. Didn't work out in the 30s and 40s, not so bad in the 50s and 60s, looks okay in Japan and Germany and parts of Scandinavia, so let's try it. Not a panacea, but a step forward.
There, and then we'll go to Peter.
Hi, I'm Angela Blanchard. I'm a senior fellow here. My work for 30 years was to address the poverty and the working poor in the Gulf Coast area and to do after disaster recovery. So I've just come through South Louisiana in the aftermath of Ida and witnessed people climbing on their roofs to put tarps, fence-line communities, and the backdrop of doing this is flaring petrochem plants who are allowed to flare before, during, and after storms. So people get to cover their roofs, breathing benzene and butadiene as they suffer the effects of the firms that continue to pollute with no repercussions. I do, however, strongly believe in capitalism. Not a popular opinion often. So I know that these same energy companies speak of a migration because they say we want to be energy companies. So we also want to lead on transition and sustainable energy options. And they are, believe it or not, making more investment in that than collectively than all the sustainable energy companies. So what I can't understand, though, in your argument is how this accountability that government must provide for these firms, for those that mean to do well, to actually have that catalytic effect, where does that enforcement come from? Because there is no enforcement on the Gulf Coast right now. We don't have, recently I was asked, which organizations work at the intersection of racial justice, environment, and disaster recovery and energy? I'm like, there is no intersection of those interests. They collide. And there's no one to sort that out in favor of anyone but the oil companies right now.
So thank you for your work, which sounds incredibly important. My hope is this. In the short term, the pressure to behave better comes from employees and customers. So I was recently talking to the CEO of one of the big oil companies, and he said, Rebecca, I built this company because I thought it was a good thing, and now everybody hates me. What happened? So he's got some internal pressure. He's getting increasing investor pressure. More than 70 trillion worth of financial assets is now insisting on at least reporting of, how much are you flaring, what are you doing, and there's pressure to try and get those metrics decent. Not perfect, but we're beginning to see the big financial investors voting against the fossil fuel company boards. You might have seen that Exxon was recently forced to take a new director under investor pressure. And Engine One, which is the financial group that led that, is gunning for other firms. Their deck is up on the web, and they're quite clear. They're gunning for these directors. These firms have to change, and they have to do it faster. Of course, that's not enough. In my belief, it only hopefully increases the odds of effective political response, which in the end is what's going to solve these problems. But I hope that the firms that are really moving faster, firms like Enel or Iberdrola in Europe or BP and Shell, which are not perfect, but at least much more authentically moving in this direction, can raise the temperature, the political temperature of saying we have to do this. This is not against capitalism. This is what we need to do. But yes, are we in a desperate situation? Yes, we are. Is this possibly helpful? Yes. Is it a guaranteed solution? Absolutely not.
Thank you. Very stimulating talk, and I look forward to reading the book. Is this on? Oh, sorry. I'm Peter Andreas. I'm here at the Watts Institute and also the Political Science Department. I found myself wondering while you're talking, I realized your audience in Reimagining Capitalism are capitalists, right? So, and good luck with that, right? In terms of convincing them to do the right thing, be enlightened capitalists, change the world, and the takeaway is that it'll be profitable and it's in your self-interest to do it. I'm wondering what your message is and what your reception has been on the progressive left. Basically, they don't trust capitalists, never have, never think they'll do the right thing in the interests of the planet. Always think what you need is more regulation, more stronger unions, social movements, and so on. How have they received your book and your message, and what have you had to say to them if they've been part of your audience at all?
They have. I have talked to, I have friends who are on the progressive left. I've talked to undergraduates at Harvard. I've talked to groups in Europe who are like, seriously, Rebecca? Like, what are you doing here? Here's my answer. Let's be very concrete. Suppose we really want to decarbonize the world's economy. That means changing what we eat, what we drive, how we live, and all our buildings. Suppose you had the world's best government and a hostile private sector that didn't want to play, that was actively undermining the government, that was trying to destroy them politically, that didn't want a partner that wasn't interested. That would be worse than a purpose-driven private sector that had committed to its employees and its customers and its suppliers that no, it really cared about deforestation and really wanted to make a difference and was willing to play ball with the government. That would make everything easier. And we've seen that. For a few years, we halted deforestation in the Amazon. Why? Because the world's largest consumer goods companies who were buying the timber and the beef and the soy were working with the Brazilian government and with the communities on the ground to improve the community on the ground by going sustainable. We're seeing this in the textile business, which is one of the most polluting and most destructive on the planet, where firms are saying we have to build a supply chain that works for everyone. And if you're on the progressive left and you don't think you're ever going to get the government you want in Pakistan, Honduras, Mexico, you'd much rather have a private sector that was committed to these ideas and shared with you the goal of a strong community. So yeah, perhaps you want utopia, but we have these large corporations, much better that they were focused on the larger whole.
Hello. I'm Caroline Karp, Emeritus Faculty in Environmental Law and Policy. And there really are a number of examples of government efforts to incentivize corporations to behave better, obviously, right? And so there's the UN Global Compact. And there are also, I guess my notion would be to go back to Garrett Hardin's theory of a tragedy of a freedom and a commons, where one can appeal to the conscience of a corporation to do the right thing. And when circumstances become sufficiently exigent, governments can compel corporations to do the right thing. And I guess what I'd like to ask you, I would think we might even agree that in fact climate change represents an increasingly exigent circumstance. And so it's really the extent to which governments might compel corporations to behave better in this regard. The extent to which you think that is a legitimate way to do things, I happen to think that. And so, whether harmonization of rules across political boundaries might be the other way to do it. So the way that NAFTA, for example, drives corporations to behave better.
So when I opened by saying that the first pass answer to problems like climate change is effective government regulation, I meant it. I'd love a price for carbon. I'd love it to be expensive to burn fossil fuels. I'd like common building standards, so when you build a building, it has to use less energy. That's where we need to go. The problem is we're not going there. You know, COP26 is make or break. We have to make progress. Will we make progress? I'm not at all sure we will. So when I talk to corporations, and Peter's entirely right, my audience is capitalists. I'm trying to say climate change is like child labor. You cannot do it anymore. You cannot burn fossil fuels. There's a collective case for it. There's an individual case for it. You need to cooperate to make sure everyone in the industry is on the same wavelength. Everyone's costs will rise. That's okay. We can handle it together. So it's not instead of government regulation, it's as a way of hastening and supporting government regulation because, just nitty-gritty, any regulatory regime will be better if it's designed with people who know what will make the difference on the ground. But the reason to focus on the private sector is because we don't have the public solution yet, in the hope that it will help us reach the public solution. Now, no one has asked, Ricky, but people do ask me, in pushing this agenda, do I make political action less likely? Will firms say, don't worry, we can solve this on our own, we don't need government action? And some firms do. But in my experience, I've worked with hundreds of firms in this space. If you're really trying to solve inequality or diversity or climate change, it becomes very clear in month 3 that you can't do it alone. That having helpful, well-designed regulation would make it infinitely easier because it would force your competitors to do the same thing. So what in fact you do is you create a constituency for broader political change. That's my belief. That's the theory of change which I'm operating with. It may, of course, not be correct, but I think it might be, and that's helpful.
Is this on? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for coming to Brown. I'm a senior studying anthropology here, and then being a Brown student, one of the best parts is having very insightful lecturers like you. So thank you. I guess my question is how can this attempt to reimagine the capitalism be persuasive to firms and governments of countries like you mentioned, India and China, or even smaller economies that enter the capitalist race later than their Western competitors? I'm asking this because they might be thinking that the companies that are leading the discourse around the ESG and sustainability, especially the big ones, are at advantages and can afford them due to their history of imperialism and exploitation. So, I guess in a sentence, how can this attempt be considered sincere and fair to those, other parts of the world? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Because I really mean it when I say there's a business case. Not to solve all of inequality and all of diversity and all of climate change, but to solve a good chunk of it. Treating people with dignity and respect, paying them well, giving them the skills they need, the firm really is more productive. Not in every industry, not all the time, but enough times that if you're a smaller country at the edge of the world economy, you can think this could be your advantage. So, Rick, you were very kind about my book has been a big success. I will tell you, it has not hit any best-selling lists anywhere, except in Japan and South Korea. There, it's like the hot thing. I'm really hot in Japan. I was like, really? Why? Because they actually believe, probably for historical reasons, that this is a better way to run the economy. And so they're trying to reinvent capitalism so it really is working for the whole society. In South Korea, I talked to a television host. She said, did you know that sustainability was sexy in South Korea? I was like, no, I did not. But I think they, partly because they're competing with China, they're doubling down on the capitalist model, but they don't want the old capitalism red in tooth and claw. It's not going to work. And so I've had a lot of interest in South America, some interest in Southern Africa. In Peru, I'm hot in Peru. Why am I hot in Peru? Because they really think capitalism is broken and they want to fix it. So I think actually, going back to my early work in innovation, and maybe this is a good way to end. For 20 years, I studied innovation in large organizations. I was the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management at MIT. Anyone remember Eastman Kodak? No. No, that's what I did. I worked with large organizations who needed to change. I believe, and this is fundamentally my answer to your question, that we face a massive potential for positive change in the world. Everything could still go terribly wrong, absolutely. But And the pandemic is part of this. This idea that we have to build a system that works for more of us, that cares for the future, that thinks of our world as an organic whole that has to be supported, that is really emerging. And where is it emerging? It's emerging at the edge, which is where change always comes from the young, from the less successful, from the smaller countries. So this is not a cynical plot to make sure that the third world never catches up. This is the first world has lost the plot, and we really need to change what we're doing. And that's why I think there's a business case here. Those firms that see this, they're finding it. Unilever for a while was amongst the 10 most desirable employers on the planet. This is a firm that makes deodorant and ice cream, because people are so excited about this change. So is it a done deal? No. Might it happen? Yes, it might. Should we do everything we can, political, social, cultural, whatever you're doing to drive this transformation? Yes, we should. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. That was great. Thank you
very much. Pleasure to excellent.